Welcome, everyone. I think we got everybody in here. Got a nice crowd tonight. My name is Crystal Hopper Myers, and I run our STEAM Pathways program here at SWOCC. And first, want to say welcome and thank you so much for attending this biology lecture. Here in just a minute, I'm going to ask our professor to come up and introduce our guests. But first, I wanted to mention a few things that we have going on. We also have our online guests. So please, if at the end of the lecture, when we have the Q&A, if you could raise your hand, then I will come up to you to give you the microphone so that you can speak in so that they can hear what your question was. It just kind of makes it easier. And then if you are listening to us online, feel free to write your questions at any point at the in the comments, and I'll be able to share them with our guests later. We also are hosting a watch party at our Curry campus, so welcome to you all as well. So one thing I wanted to share, first, I'm super proud of our awesome student research team, SPEAR. So I always like to say a few things about them. We actually have a group of students who will be traveling to Oregon State to present their research. They were part of a faculty research award that was led by our geology professor, which I believe is in here, right back there, Dr. Wynn McLaughlin. And so Dr. Wynn had led this project, and it had to do with Fossil Point. So they're going to be traveling down there. We're supposed to be down there already for symposium, but due to the unexpected weather, it was rescheduled. So we'll be going down next month to have them present at the symposium for the Oregon NASA Space Grant Consortium. And we always like to say thank you to OSGC for the continued support with our program. With that project as well, we had a combination of professors with that, including with biology, we had chemistry, we had physics, we had just a combination of students that were working with that. So it was pretty exciting. Also, I would like to say thank you to the Oregon Coast STEM Hub for continued support with our program as well. They have a new high school STEM internship program, and we have a great group of students. There's actually 3 of them right now who have been doing an internship to work on hands-on research. They also help us with some of our local community outreach and K-12 events. For upcoming events, I did want to mention that Dr. Coiner will be speaking at the Bandon Library for an update on the NASA's Punch mission. And also at the North Bend Library. He'll be over there on Earth Day. So April 1st was Bandon Library. April 22nd, he'll be at the North Bend Library, both at 6 o'clock. We have an upcoming, our annual STEM student art exhibit will be on display at Eden Hall. It'll be open each day from like 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. You can go by and check it out. It's going to be there April 10th through the end of the month till the 30th. And the theme this year was Our Ocean Through Time. We have a variety of students, faculty, admin, a bunch of different people contributing pieces to that. So it's going to be in a variety of different forms of art. April 29th, we have STEAM for Girls. Their theme for that event is actually, it's STEAM Club for Girls, kind of a new program we started. Our theme for that event is underwater robotics. That program is focused on about 5th grade and up. Sometimes we have a couple of them that are a little bit younger than that. It's going to be 6 to 8 p.m. on April 29th, and we start in this room actually and go up to the labs. Got planetarium shows, pretty cool. If you are interested in registering your student for that, you can come see me later. I can give you some more information, but the best way is just take one of my cards up front there and send me an email. The last thing I was going to mention is at our Curry campus, since we have Curry visitors online, May 5th from 4 to 7 p.m., we're going to be at the Curry campus with a planetarium show. We had a really great one recently at the Curry Library in Gold Beach. Had a couple hundred people there. It was just amazing. So yes, that planetarium, if you haven't had a chance to check it out, you should definitely follow our SWOCC STEAM Pathways Facebook page. Check out the college news mailers. We try to get it out there in the local media as well, and you can get online to SWOCC.edu. With that said, I want to hand this over to our awesome biology professor, Amy Burgess, so that she can tell you a little bit about our guest this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. Hello, I'm Amy Burgess. Thank you all for coming. This is great. First, before I give Kyle's bio, I just want to say I met Kyle surfing, and some of us surfers are a little lazy when it comes to learning each other's names. And so for a long time, I knew Kyle as Sea Otter Kyle, because there were multiple Kyles that were surfers, and so we kind of just give nicknames to each other. So Sea Otter Kyle is our presenter today. Kyle is the Coastal Community Coordinator for the Elakha Alliance. He received his master's in natural resources from the University of Vermont, where he focused on forest ecology. He has worked on monitoring, restoration, and forestry projects with the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park System, and several local government agencies around the country. Kyle has an extensive background working with endangered species, threatened ecosystems, stakeholder engagement, and watershed restoration projects on private and public lands. Since moving to the South Coast, Kyle has worked with local nonprofit groups to successfully implement habitat restoration projects focused on coho salmon and oak woodlands. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kyle.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Cool. Well, thank you for coming. I'm Sea Otter Kyle, and I'm the Coastal Community Coordinator for the Elakha Alliance, and I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about sea otters, their history, and some of the work that we are doing to bring them back to the Oregon coast. I've tried to maximize the amount of cute otter photos while also still giving you guys some good information. So I'm briefly going to talk about sea otter life history, the population status, both current and past, some of the efforts and considerations that go into reintroducing a population of sea otters to the Oregon coast. I'll talk a little bit about my group, the Elakha Alliance, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussions. So I promised, cute sea otter photo. This guy right here is a sea otter, and sea otters are in the mustelid family. Mustelids are a family of carnivorous mammals that includes weasels, skunks, wolverines, and badgers. And there are 3 subspecies of sea otters. There's a northern subspecies, a southern subspecies, and an Asian subspecies. And they live in coastal waters, usually within a half-mile from shore. They tend to be found in areas that include rocky shorelines and reefs, are known to utilize kelp canopies for foraging, resting, and protection from predators. They're very social animals. They aggregate in groups called rafts. So a group of sea otters is a raft of sea otters. They often stay with the same cohort of individuals their entire lives. They live in the cold Pacific waters, and they spend almost their entire life in the water, but they are the only marine mammal without blubber. Instead, they have the densest fur of any animal on Earth. They have 1 million hairs per square inch. I actually brought my pelt that we can pass around, and you can feel it. You also get an idea of how big they are. This is a little bit of a small one, but I'll have Amy pass this around, and you can really feel how they stay warm. The other way that they stay warm is they have an extremely high metabolism. They eat about 30% of their body weight every day, and that really fuels their metabolic rate to keep them warm. And that's equivalent to me eating about 48 pounds of food every day. So that is how much they eat. And in order to feed so much, they're very efficient divers and foragers, often feeding on urchins, crabs, clams, and other shellfish. They can dive extremely deep, up to about 250 feet. That's very taxing on the animal. Most sea otter foraging dives are done under 60 feet. It's real easy to see what they like to eat because they carry all of their food to the surface. They're one of the few animals that use tools. They often have favorite rocks, which they'll lay on their belly as anvils to smash open clams and other shellfish. They're a very slow breeding species. They have about one pup at a time, and pups are dependent on their mother for up to a year. Moms nurse their pups for the first 6 months of their lives and then teach them how to dive and forage for food. And they can often be seen wrapping themselves and their pup in kelp to avoid drifting during storms and high wind. And while sea otters are the smallest marine mammal, but they can still get pretty big, up to about 80 pounds or the size of a German Shepherd. By contrast, harbor seals weigh about 350 pounds, and most of that is just because of the amount of blubbers that harbor seals have to stay warm. And sea otters are about 3 times larger than a river otter, which is important because it is very common for people to mistake the two. So here you can see some of the main differences between sea otters and river otters. Sea otters are bigger. They're very buoyant. They float high in the water, whereas river otters are not. They ride low. Sea otters swim on their back with large rear flippers that help them propel in the water, whereas river otters swim on their bellies and all 4 feet are the same size. The other distinguishing feature is that sea otters always have one pup at a time, whereas river otters have multiple pups. And while we have lots of river otters in the state, we do not have sea otters. But once they were here in Oregon. Sea otters used to cover the entire North Pacific, from Baja, California, and Mexico, all the way up the North American coast through California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Alaska, across the Bering Strait into Russia and even northern Japan. It was estimated that there were around 200,000 animals worldwide. We don't know exactly how many sea otters were here in Oregon, but the best guesses we have is about 4,000 from some modeling that was done. But how do we know that sea otters were here if we don't have them? One of the ways is that every coastal indigenous language has their own word for sea otter. We take our name Elakha from the Chinook word for sea otter. We also know they were here because of the special role that sea otter pelts played in tribal societies. And they were precious items that gave wealth and status to the wearer. There's a lot of traditional narratives that have been passed down about otter skins being a rare prize for protagonists in stories. And there are also stories about how sea otters were viewed as respected kin and really linked the natural cycles that brought people food and prosperity. We know sea otters were here because of the early accounts of white settlers. The first American ship in the Columbia, captained by Robert Grave, sent back several reports about beaver skins and otter pelts. There's this interesting article in the Harper's Bazaar, which tells of the author going on a sea otter hunting expedition here in Coos Bay in 1855. And lastly, we have geographic place names on the coast, named for sea otters, which have been passed down to English, such as Otter Rock in Lincoln County and Otter Point in Curry County. So we know that sea otters are here. How do we have any idea of their abundance? The only information we really have, besides some travel logs and some notes sent from early white settlers, is the archaeological evidence on the coast. Sea otter bones are the second most numerous marine mammal bone and shell midden sites across Oregon. And some of the genetic work on those bones have shown that Oregon was really where the northern subspecies of sea otter and the southern subspecies kind of cross paths and shared genetics. So it was a really big genetic link for those two populations. So if sea otters were here and now they're not, what happened? Beginning in the mid-1700s, sea otters were aggressively hunted for their fur pelts during the maritime fur trade. Russian, British, and American ships hunted sea otters for their pelts, often using forced labor of indigenous peoples. They were mostly selling these pelts to China, where the pelts were a sign of power and royalty by the upper class. And there was intense hunting pressure for these, and people made a lot of money. It's estimated that one of those pelts in the 1800s was worth about $15,000 in today. The fur trade in Oregon, it wasn't a prime target for the fur trade. There's few natural large harbors on our coast. The otter populations, which were what most fur traders were going for, were likely dispersed. And so we don't have a lot of information about the fur trade here in Oregon. But we do know that they were scarce by the early 1800s across the entire Pacific. They technically gained protection from harvest under the International Fur Seal Treaty in 1911, but by then they had been hunted so extensively that it was no longer profitable to hunt them at the low numbers that they were at. It's thought that they were eliminated entirely from Oregon by the early 1900s. The last evidence that I've seen of sea otter, a native Oregon sea otter, is this article published in the Coos Bay Times in 1910, which tells of a Mr. S.E. Brown buying a sea otter pelt for $500 from someone who shot one in Port Orford. And even though there was extensive hunting pressure during the fur trade and 99% of sea otters were killed in the fur trade, there were about 13 populations that survived. And you could see that most of them are in pretty isolated places. You have Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. Interestingly enough, about 50 animals survived in Big Sur, California, which must have been isolated enough that they escaped detection. And we are happy that they did escape detection because they have provided the basis for the revival of the species. And this is where you can see sea otters today. So from there to that has really been a big change. So where can you find sea otters today in the US if you were? You can find them in California. California has the southern subspecies of sea otters. Right now, they range from Santa Cruz in the north to Point Conception in the south, which is about 300 miles of the California coast. And there are about 3,000 animals in this population. That might sound like a lot, but that's about 13% of their original range in the state. And they're being limited from spreading both more north and more south because of shark bites. Great white sharks don't prey on sea otters. They're looking to go after something with blubber. But like they do to surfers, unfortunately, they take exploratory bites, which is not good for surfers or otters. There are major concerns about the genetic limitation of this population. Every sea otter in this population is descendant from that original 50 that survived in Big Sur. So this population has gone through an extreme genetic bottleneck in the past. You can find sea otters in Washington. Washington has the northern subspecies. Animals were reintroduced to the Olympic Peninsula in the 1970s, and there's also about 3,000 animals in the Washington population. There are major concerns about the harm that potential oil spills could do to sea otters here. As shown in like some of the film and footage from the Exxon Valdez spill, oil covers an otter's fur, it's unable to clean it, it dies of hypothermia. You can also find sea otters in British Columbia, which has a large and growing population of otters. But the most otters you could find today are in Alaska. Alaska also has the northern subspecies. They were almost entirely eliminated from the state by the mid-1800s. There were no otters in Southeast Alaska at that time. And so 450 of them were reintroduced to Southeast Alaska from the Aleutian Islands. And that population has grown to almost 30,000 animals at this point. And that's due to the high carrying capacity of this region. When you think of Southeast Alaska, it's islands, it's fjords, it's inlets, it's sea otter heaven. And has really been a huge success story in the conservation of the species, but has also really led to some human use conflicts in the area. You can imagine what 30,000 otters eating 30% of their body weight every day could do to certain shellfish that people like to eat and also make money off of. There was a reintroduction attempt done here in Oregon as well in the 1970s. All of these reintroductions in British Columbia, in Southeast Alaska, in Washington, and in Oregon were all done because there was atomic bomb testing being planned on Amchitka Island, and Fish and Wildlife Service needed to remove those animals. They brought 50 to Port Orford and 40 to Coos Bay in the 1970s. 11 pups were born over the course of about 10 years, but that population ultimately kind of petered out. We've kind of looked into why the Oregon reintroduction wasn't successful. What they found during all of these reintroductions was that if you put 100 wild-caught animals into an area, immediately half of them leave, wanting to go back to their original site. So if they put 90 animals into Oregon, half them left, that brought them down to 45. That's not a lot of animals to kind of counter effect any skewed male to sex ratio, a couple shark bites, bad weather. So that population just became non-self-sustaining. And this was also kind of done a little, shoot from the hip cowboy style. There wasn't a lot of planning. They needed to get the animals out. They brought them down, released them into open water. The one in Coos Bay was done in like pretty terrible storm events. A couple of the animals drowned. So it was not, as far as we were concerned, a successful attempt at reintroduction. And while we don't have a native population here in Oregon, we still do occasionally see them on the Oregon coast. They are almost always young males coming down from the Olympic Peninsula population looking for mates, and there are none here for them, which is exactly what my dating experience was like when I first moved to the coast. And anyone who has been single and lives in Coos Bay knows the struggle. But there was one in Newport in 2021, another in Reedsport in 2016, and then one in Depot Bay in 2009. And if you guys paid attention to the news this summer, there were two up on the North Coast at Elakha State Park. And I have a little video that my coworker took. Let's see if it'll play. Yeah, so we get calls all the time about people thinking they see sea otters. They're almost always river otters. This person was very persistent. It was swimming on its back. It had large rear feet. So my coworker made the drive from Portland and captured this video. And sure enough, there are two sea otters. He's hauled out, hanging out on that rock. And they hung out up there for about a month. One washed up with a shark bite. The necropsy showed that it was a young male from Washington. We're not sure where the other one went, but there was one that washed up in Bullards Beach in Bandon in September, which U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is assuming was one of these two. So, I mean, why do we even care if sea otters are here in Oregon or not? One of the main reasons is that they're a keystone species. And a keystone species is one that significantly and disproportionately affects the structure and the function of its surrounding ecological community. They're like beavers. What do beavers do? Beavers build dams. Dams flood an area. That influences what types of plants grow in that area, influences what types of animals eat and live in those plants, then influences what types of animals eat those animals. Similar to wolves. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, they started feeding on elk. The elk stopped hanging out along streams and rivers. They stopped eating all of the willows and trees that were growing along those rivers. Those plants came back. They cooled the water. Native fish came back. Songbirds came back. So this one animal, these one types of animal having this huge impact on their surrounding ecological environment. And sea otters were really the animal that exemplified the concept of a keystone species. This was shown and found during some research in the 1970s by a man named Jim Estes. While Jim was diving off of Amchitka Island, where those atomic bomb tests were being planned, which had a healthy population of sea otters, he saw this photo on the left, this beautiful kelp forest, all of the shellfish and the fish that use that kelp forest to feed, to live. While diving off of nearby Shemya Islands, which did not have sea otters, instead of that kelp forest, what Jim found was this picture on the right here, an urchin barren. So the idea is similar to wolves. Sea otters, by preying on urchins, limit urchin populations. Those urchin populations stop devouring kelp, allows that kelp to grow, and provides benefits to all those animals that use kelp. And why do we care about kelp? And kelp is an amazing plant. It's really the foundation of our nearshore ecosystem, complex habitat for a variety of marine life. It's associated with huge amounts of biodiversity. It helps buffer ocean waves and current and stops erosion on our shorelines, and also captures and stores carbon and is thought to be instrumental in our fight against climate change. In Oregon, we mostly have bull kelp, which is this picture here on the left. In California, they have giant kelp and bull kelp, but interestingly enough, there is one known spot where we have giant kelp in Oregon, and it's right out here in Simpson Reef. And I have not found anyone who can tell me why that is, but it's there. There have just been years and decades of science that talk about the benefits that sea otters have to kelp systems. Here's just a quick graph that I pulled from a paper that showed the increases of kelp for 5 years and 20 years after sea otter reintroduction, and then the associated increase in the animals that use that kelp system. And similarly, that same paper showed that areas with sea otters can have about 46 times more rockfish just because of the kelp systems that sea otters help sustain. And they've also been shown to have really great benefits to estuaries as well. There's an estuary in California called Elkhorn Slough, and sea otters have been reintroduced to that estuary and are actually a resident population. They don't leave that estuary. And they have seen their eelgrass beds in that estuary recover since sea otter reintroduction. It's a similar concept to the urchins. They're in estuaries. There are small slugs and snails that graze on algae that grow on eelgrass. Without predators, bay crabs grow in number. They devour those slugs and algae. Then eelgrass, they devour those slugs and snails, and then eelgrass gets covered with algae, suffocates, and dies out. Sea otters were brought in, started feeding on the crabs, and allowed the algae grazers to do their jobs. There's also been a recent paper showing that sea otters are eating thousands and thousands of invasive European green crab in that estuary. And eelgrass, like kelp, is just a crucial plant. It improves water quality, increases biological productivity, is amazing habitat for a wide variety of fish and wildlife. And this is all important because we have a changing ocean with real threats. And right now, we are losing kelp forests across the coast. There's some pretty sensational headlines that have been posted about this. I think my favorite is California's underwater forests are being eaten by the cockroaches of the ocean. It's easy to demonize purple urchins, but they are a native species. I mean, they are part of this ecosystem, but we have an unbalanced ecosystem. And it's not just happening in California, it's happening in Oregon as well. This photo on the left is a shot of a kelp forest at Orford Reef in Port Orford. It's a little murky, which I guess most diving is in Oregon, but you see some beautiful little kelp stand. On the right, 2 years later, in the same spot, that kelp is being devoured by purple urchins there. In a healthy ecosystem, urchins live in crevices and cracks to hide from predators, and they eat bits of kelp that break off and drift down to them. But without predators, their populations quickly grow and they can decimate kelp forests. And they don't just move into an area, eat kelp, and leave. They can survive in a so-called zombie state for decades without food, ingesting their own innards, waiting for more kelp to come back. So the Pacific coast in general is facing a changing ocean and seeing a dramatic loss of kelp beds and eelgrass. And one factor, the loss of predators, and it's not just the sea otter, there's also been the crash of the sunflower sea star due to a wasting disease. Sunflower sea stars also eat purple urchins. There's marine heat waves, there's warming oceans. Like there's a lot that's happening that is leaving our system unbalanced. And when I moved here about 8 years ago, I remember walking along the coast and you're just like, wow, this is a pristine, untouched, beautiful environment. And it is beautiful, but it is unbalanced at this moment. That was a little doom and gloom. And so I'm going to transition into what we're trying to do to bring them back. One of the questions we get a lot at the Elakha Alliance is why sea otters? Why now? We believe that sea otters are key in helping to restore the ecosystem function of our nearshore environment. They're a keystone species. Again, they have that huge impact on their environment relative to their abundance. There's a lot of science that shows that they have foundational effects on kelp forest ecosystems as key predators of sea urchins. We were started in the late 1990s by a Siletz tribal member named David Hatch. He had built a boat with his son Peter, and he was looking for a name for that boat, and he found the word Elakha in a Chinook language dictionary. And this really sparked his interest in raised questions about why sea otters were missing from Oregon, whether it mattered, and what could be done to bring them back. Unfortunately, Dave passed away in 2016, but a small group of people involved in his conceptual Elakha Alliance met to make his vision a reality. We are currently have a board of 15 members who help kind of drive our work and our vision, and we also have an advisory council that's a broader group of people, mostly on the coast, who help kind of make sure that we're moving in the right direction. And our mission as an organization is to restore a healthy population of sea otters to the Oregon coast, and in the process, help make Oregon's marine ecosystem more robust and more resilient. And this mission statement deliberately has that broader ecosystem theme because we don't think that sea otters are a silver bullet to fixing the marine issues. We think they're a key part of the piece, but there are a lot of groups working on this from different angles. We've done several strategic planning processes over the past couple years. They have highlighted two main objectives for our work. One is just completing the scientific assessment and the policy analysis to determine if it is feasible to bring sea otters back to Oregon and what the impacts might be. The other objective is a lot of the work that I do, which is helping to build regional consensus that this is an idea worth pursuing for our coast. And only if we feel like we're successful in those two objectives would we work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other partners to proceed with restoration in carefully chosen sites. Some of the work that we have finished, we completed a feasibility study in 2022 that brought together 6 of the world's leading otter ecologists just to ask that question. Is it feasible? Is there food here for them? Is there habitat here for them? What would reintroduction look like? Consensus was yes, it is feasible, but there are a lot of considerations in building a reintroduction plan. We've done various high-level economic assessments and GIS assessments of coastal regions. I'm currently helping amend, this says the Oregon Nearshore Conservation Strategy. They changed that now to the State Wildlife Action Plan. I'm helping to amend that with ODFW. And we also completed an impact study on the impacts for the tourism economy on the South Coast. And from some of this work, what we found is that reintroductions are a successful conservation tool. The reason that there are otters, there we go. The reason that there are otters in Southeast Alaska, in Washington, in British Columbia are because of reintroductions. We found that reintroducing sea otters to Oregon is likely to succeed with appropriate considerations, and those are mostly social, economic, and regulatory. I'll touch on them in a second. We think that the return of sea otters will have many direct and indirect effects. The direct ones are a little bit easier to kind of pull out and piece together, but the indirect effects, we're still working to figure out if what we don't know, we don't know. And then we've also found that estuaries may be an important reintroduction environment as seen in Elkhorn Slough in California. So this is all on the ground level. This is a long federal process to reintroduce sea otters to the Oregon coast. And right now we are working on building the plan to do that. Some of the considerations that are kind of being teased out right now between Elakha, partners in California, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, one of them is the regulatory protections. Sea otters in California are on the endangered species list, but all sea otters are protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. There's the habitat suitability and site selection. Where would you put animals? Originally, it was thought just kelp beds on the South Coast where we have the most kelp. There's a new model being built that takes in years of data, of sea otter science, and is really showing us that estuaries and some spots on mid-coast might actually be a decent spot for reintroduction. But it still looks like, lucky for us, the best spot really is here in Cape Arago. Where would we get source animals from? Would we take them from California, or would we take them from Alaska, which has a lot? There's a bigger drive to bring sea otters from California because they're on the endangered species list. And so that would help recover that population and take them off the list. There's the animal health, behavior, and welfare for reintroduction. As I said, in the past attempts in Oregon in the 1970s, they had animals drowning in cages in the water. I want to make sure that that is not a part of any reintroduction in the future. And also, this is going to be a huge undertaking, and the capacity for local communities, for the federal government, for the state government to manage and support this undertaking is really huge. The Oregon Coast Aquarium is updating some of their facilities and building a marine mammal stranding program, and they're doing that with the idea of sea otter reintroduction in the future being part of that. Just quickly, some of the stuff that we're continuing to work on or want to continue working on is collaborating at a regional scale. In Northern California, north of Santa Cruz does not have sea otters. We're working with partners down there to kind of do this as a regional approach. We're trying to always increase our public outreach and community engagement, so I appreciate being here to talk to you guys about this. We also are working to fill some of the science and policy gaps that we've identified through our feasibility study. We're always looking to increase tribal engagement. We were just awarded with the Siletz tribe a $1.6 million grant from America the Beautiful, which would have given most of that money to 4 tribes on the coast to build capacity to start to take the lead in this. That kind of got put into the ether with the federal funding freeze. We haven't heard that it is coming through, but we haven't heard that it isn't. So we're fingers crossed on that one. We have a lot. My coworker Chanel does a great job with social media. We have a great newsletter that I can sign you up for if you're interested. We do have a lot of events up and down the coast and in the valley with webinars, presentations, and event tabling. If you're into beer, we do our annual beer fest where breweries compete to brew an otter-themed beer. It's in Portland at OMSI. It's a lot of fun. I think this year we have like 15 breweries, 3 wineries, a sake company, and a cider company. So it's gone beyond just beer. But it's one of our biggest fundraisers. It's a lot of fun. Lastly, an alliance is all about partnerships, and we are grateful for the range of partners that really support and make the work we do possible. It's a real collaborative effort. And with that, I can take any questions.
Try to get to you guys as soon as I can get there.
So, my question is, do any of the sea otters exist in warmer waters like the Hawaiian chain of islands?
No, they're a cold water species. I mean, they were in Baja California in Mexico, which is warmer, but not warm water, no.
You said that one of the sites that you might be looking at is in Coos Bay or Shore Acres. We have a lot of sea lions and we have a lot of harbor seals hanging out there. How is the compatibility with sea otters?
They're feeding on different things. They coexist in other places, California, Washington. Yeah, there's really not much competition there.
Okay.
Was the original population in Oregon northern or southern?
So it was a mix of both. The genetic testing from the bones at Midden sites showed that there were both northern subspecies and southern subspecies, which is one of the big reasons we'd like to reintroduce a population to Oregon, because right now, otters in California they have that genetic bottleneck and they're cut off from any input from about 900 miles of open coast. So there's no genetic diversity getting into that population.
Since shellfish are a big part of their diet and Dungeness crab are a big part of the economic base on the Oregon coast, what's the impact of sea otters on the Dungeness crab fishery?
Yeah, that's a good question and a lot of unknowns. So in Southeast Alaska, where sea otters are reintroduced and that number went up to 30,000, the Dungeness crab industry did take a hit up there. We don't, at the height of sea otter populations, there were maybe 4,000 in Oregon. I don't think that we have the habitat or the prey to get anywhere close to 4,000 in the future. So I don't think there will be that widespread impact. Also in Southeast Alaska, the continental shelf extends relatively far off. So much of where people are crabbing is in sea otter dive depth range. In Oregon, our continental shelf dives down pretty quickly. And I do a lot of work with talking to fishermen between Newport and Brookings. From what I know, a lot of the fleet is fishing at depths way outside of sea otter dive range. I do know fishermen in Port Orford and Brookings who probably will see impacts, who are putting crab pots in and close enough to shore that sea otters might have some impact. I think small local operators might see some impact. Again, it's a lot of unknown. My feeling is that there won't be as big of or anywhere near the impact that they saw in Southeast Alaska.
But you have no idea.
Yeah, we have models that tell us potentially how many otters might be here in the future, but that's about the best guess that we can say.
Are the crab associations supported?
The Dungeness Crab Commission, in the past, their stance was that they do not want to see anything move forward without further science, socioeconomic policies, and like assessments being done. I know I go to most of their meetings. I talk to them. There are definitely people who are not supportive of this. I know fishermen who don't think it's going to be a big deal. I know a lot who say that they don't have enough information to make that decision. I say it's a varied opinion on it right now.
I'm a curious individual, so I'm gonna be that person, just to let you know. So we also have an urchin, a commercial urchin fishery down in Port Orford, right?
Yeah.
Has there been any comment from that commercial fisheries?
Yeah, and they're a hard group to really get in touch with. Most of the urchin diving, there's 12 permits across the state right now. So it's a relatively small fishery. It's declined a lot, I think, since the 90s. I think 3 families own the majority of those permits. And from what I know, a lot of them are fishing off of rogue reef. That's where they're doing their diving. I do think that is like more than the crab industry, the people who are going to see actual impact. I have tried to reach out. I've talked to a couple. It's a hard group to kind of break into, but yeah, I do think that's the one that's really going to see impacts.
So then I have another question about the economic impacts, is that we're also looking at, I know that there's discussions about the shipping container that's on the North Spit or that's being planned for the North Spit. Has there been any modeling or remodeling based on that? Because I know that that's going to decimate some serious eelgrass.
Yeah, and it's really difficult working in like a small nonprofit that's kind of laser focused on one issue, and things get very political very fast. And so I would say that where we would make a stance on that, or where we would have better idea, is like what the actual traffic in the estuary would be like and how that lines up with where sea otters might potentially be according to modeling. Yeah. Yes, and and from what I know, that's not on the paper yet. I mean, it sounds like it's really coming down the pipeline, but yeah, The model we have was built with data based on like eelgrass cover in the estuary.
So were there examples of that in like the Southern California population or the Santa Cruz population? There are some pretty industrialized areas down there in Southern California. Are there examples of sea otters and those large sort of being in the same area at the same time?
I don't think so. So I think, because I know that there's also there's a lot of talk about sea otter reintroduction to San Francisco Bay, because historically, before the fur trade, San Francisco Bay held a huge amount of sea otters. And there's this idea of like that might be a great area for reintroduction because of that. But I think the amount of traffic in San Francisco Bay has some partners in California concerned about that. I don't know about other areas that have ports large enough to have shipping containers, but that's a good question, and that's one that I could bring up with some of their regional partners and ask. No, that's the great question.
Then you've got that limitation of San Francisco Bay there, which is fundamentally fine, right? And then on top of that, I'm wondering about like the Winchester Bay dunes, because I know that that's like shark heaven, right? So
Yeah.
any surfer knows that you don't surf by the dunes because that's where all the great whales are, right? So same idea with the sea otters is that they're basically bottlenecked again on the south by the bay, and then on the north by the Winchester dunes. Are we just creating another situation where there's going to be a genetic bottleneck in Oregon?
I would say that, so sharks and sea otters historically coexisted, right? The reason that sea otters cannot make it past Santa Cruz at this point is because there's not that like huge population momentum to like get them past there. If there's so as we're thinking about reintroduction now, regional, and again, there is no plan put in place, but there would most likely be one done in Northern California and one done in Oregon. And we would hope that that eventual spread would make kind of corridors enough, because we are seeing sea otters from Washington make it down here. So it wouldn't take too many of those to actually put some more, genetic diversity into the population.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions online, and then we'll go back to the people, the guests that are here. Artemis online asked, when are we starting reintroduction at Coos Bay?
To clarify, Coos Bay has not been a chosen site. I just want to put that out there. None of this has been kind of set in stone. There's been no formal decision made. Just from modeling, Coos Bay looks like it has some of the better habitat in the state. When we would start, that's a hard question. Like, as it's always been seen, sea otter reintroduction is the prerogative of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have jurisdiction over sea otters as a marine mammal. They would be the ones who would make the decision to formally reintroduce sea otters. That starts a whole federal legal process, like a NEPA process, an environmental impact assessment. I don't imagine U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service making a choice to do that under the current administration. So 4 years there, another couple years till a decision is made, it's probably 7 to 10 years out if everything goes well.
My question is about the economic modeling and predicting. You mentioned green crabs are one of the prey of the otters. So is that factored into the economic modeling of like if there's, because right now green crabs have a negative impact on our local fisheries, including Dungeness and other fisheries, especially oyster farmers. And so I'm wondering if that's like a plus in the reintroduction in terms of economic modeling?
I think so. And I think that is to come. We're working on like some more detailed socioeconomic stuff now. That paper about European green crab was just published like very recently. But I mean, yeah, I do think that economically that can be a plus. But yeah, I think we're part of that America the Beautiful grant was going to fund like a large scale socioeconomic study. That is one of the key pieces that we're still trying to get off the ground. But yeah, I think that would be part of that for sure.
Online guest Sabrina asks, is it possible for a sea otter to have more than one pup?
I mean, possible, sure. I think it's probably very rare.
Do we have more here? Hold on one second.
One at a time. Yep. Well, I guess one, they nurse and maybe one every other year.
How long is their gestation?
I don't know. I've asked that before, and I've been asked that before, and I was supposed to look that up, and I totally forgot. Yeah, actually, that would be great.
How do you model like hypothetical otter reintroduction? I mean, what type of numerical or other model is appropriate for that?
You're asking the wrong person about that.
Oh, okay.
We work with Dr. Tim Tinker, who is like an expert in sea otter population dynamics and modeling. He's like world renowned. He has kind of walked me through some of the data sets in coding, and it is way over my head. I would love, once it's done. Yeah, I mean, it's run by like a huge computer at Monterey Bay Aquarium. It's really amazing what he can forecast and show and all the data that he's used. I'm definitely the wrong person to ask about that, but Tim Tinker. Yeah.
What's the territorial area of a raft? I mean, are they localized, don't go very far, or are they 10 or miles?
It depends on population density, but it's like several kilometers. Usually they're hanging out in the same area. Females more so when they have pups. They have a strong site affinity. It's kind of similar to even like humans. It's the young ones who go out and kind of do that and like
take off.
Yeah. So like, yeah, the young males from Washington are an example of that, right? But most sea otters have a strong site affinity and staying in the same.
And my other question is, you said estuaries. How far up an estuary do they go?
That would depends a lot on probably like the eelgrass cover. In Elkhorn Slough, they do something which a lot of populations don't do. They go a couple miles up the estuary and haul out, meaning they get out of the water and they go onto the land. And I mean, they are awkward animals on land. So like river otters, when you see on land, they're graceful. And on land, they don't have the hip bones for walking. So they kind of just like slug it along. But so they go several miles up that estuary. I mean, Coos Estuary has eelgrass beds up towards like where the History Museum is. I know that in that initial modeling that showed kind of like red on some possible sea otter.
They brackish. They never go fresh.
Yeah.
Mom had a question.
Yes, I wondered, is this river otter have a different diet than the sea otter? So does it not help the kelp beds and stuff?
Yeah, river otters are eating mostly fish. Yeah, and I think did someone say ducks? I think a couple river otters ate a duck in Mingus Park the other week. I had like 5 people call me about it. I was like, I don't work with river otters.
Also, does the orcas attack the sea otters?
It's an interesting question. There's only one population in the Aleutian Islands where orcas have been shown to prey on sea otters. And they've done it so effectively that those sea otters are in a secluded bay with a bar that the orcas can't cross, and they don't leave that bay. But that is the only population that we know of where orcas are actively preying on. They're like sharks. They want to go for blubber. That's high calorie, right? They want to go for seals. They want to go for sea lions. But for some reason, that population up there has learned to and is continuing to hunt sea otters.
Okay, I have another one online. Would the South Slough be a good place for a protected population?
I mean, yeah. Really, that would be a beautiful spot. I'm not sure of I know that they have seen a pretty heavy loss of some of their eelgrass cover, but being in a protected area like that would be definitely beneficial for a reintroduction environment.
Brett online says, what about Humboldt Bay in California?
I'm not too privy to the population and habitat stuff in Northern California, but I know that basically anything north of Santa Cruz is being modeled to look at potential reintroduction sites. you could talk to someone from Monterey Bay Aquarium or Defenders of Wildlife. They might have a better idea. They do a lot of the California work.
So given the environmental impacts that they'll have on the seagrasses and the reefs, is there any negative impacts that they will bring in? Will they bring in possible diseases that could affect the river otter population we have here or affect negatively the fish content that we have here?
The diseases, not that I know of. The negative impacts, I mean, that we think of, right, are going to be the economic ones, the crab industry, the urchin fishery. You know, I think that there's also positive impacts to fisheries. Like there's, you know, more kelp means more rockfish. Salmon smolts, when they're migrating out to the ocean, use kelp forests for cover. You know, I think when a lot of us think of the sustainability of an animal, right? Like there's a difference between the conservation of a species and the conservation of a fishery. And so like, I know Amy was talking about the abalone. Like sea otters eat abalone. We don't have a lot of abalone here in Oregon. If we reintroduce sea otters, I mean, there's probably, even without sea otters, there'd probably never be another recreational or commercial abalone fishery here. But like, if you think about the conservation of abalone as a species, sea otter benefits to kelp will most likely help abalone in some way.
Okay, so following up with that, then, given your pushback that you've had so far with the Dungeness crab industries and the urchin, I wouldn't say pushback with them, but not being able to get in contact with them, what's your time frame look like in maybe creating a better positive public outlook on this rehoming?
I mean, if broadly public outlook, and I would say that 90% of people I talk to either don't know that sea otters aren't here or are supportive of bringing sea otters back. With the fishermen, that's a hard one. I mean, I honestly don't think that, like, my aim is not to change minds or convert people. Like, I don't know if actively trying to elicit 100% support from the crab industry is feasible or even like realistic. And I think my goal is to share the information that I have available so people can make informed choices. And with that, I'm using the new model to be able to go to several ports on the coast and show people in the crab industry and other fisheries, like, this is what reintroduction might look like 5 years after release, 15 years after release, 30 years after release, so people can see for themselves where there most likely might be spatial impact. So, yeah.
Okay, so would it be more beneficial to do a protected central area where they're kept and monitored heavily, or would it be more beneficial for if you just did an open rehabilitation?
They've tried keeping sea otters to one area in California, and they're going to go where they want to go. As they move, they're going to go where the food is.
So online, Natalie says, it is accurate that otters support healthy kelp forest, which we know supports fisheries long-term. So any short-term decrease would be offset by medium, long-term improved ecosystems. I think that was supposed to be a question. Is it accurate that?
I mean, it's hard. I feel like I'm being asked to predict the future in a lot of these questions. I mean, that is the whole reason for the idea of reintroducing sea otters. Like, I think that there is an intrinsic value to themselves. Like, they are a native species to Oregon. I feel like they deserve to be here. But I also think that the benefits to kelp and eelgrass is one of the reasons why this is being kind of pushed forward and why people in general are supportive of it.
But in your statements, when you're addressing one of the most economic, successful fisheries that we depend on for our livelihood, and the fishermen on the coast, especially on the central and south coast with crab, and all you can say, well, this might happen, you can understand how that population is saying, well, that's kind of hard to buy if it just might.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. I mean, again, that's I'm not like, I don't go to those meetings to convert people or change minds. I go to hear what their concerns are and try to share information. Like, I think those are very valid concerns. Absolutely.
That where the modeling would come in. So people are clearly needing information. So there's the environmental modeling, but there's probably economic modeling to show what those impacts would be.
Yeah, and as I said to Maria's question, like the model as it's built now is kind of like being used as the basis, hopefully, to answer some of those questions with more statistical analysis. Right now, it was built as a where is like the best chances for reintroduction success ecologically. But those numbers from what animal populations might look like in the future we are hoping to use them to try to answer some of those questions. Again, I'm not a modeler. I don't know how you would model, because sea otters eat 110 different species, right? And some of it is learned from their mom, some of it's not. I don't know how you would model specific potential impacts to one species, but I mean, I think that's kind of like the idea with the model in the future.
Yeah, but you said you're not a modeler, so that's cool. So what I was getting at is there are trade-offs that you described, ecosystem benefits that are bigger than just individual populations of species. And some of those ecosystem benefits theoretically improve success rates, survival success rates for Dungeness crab. And so it seems like there's a model to be done or modeling to be done, or maybe it's already being done, where you identify what those trade-offs are. Like, oh, yes, they'll be here, but because they're here, there's much better conditions for Dungeness crabs and juvenile crabs to create a bigger population, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems like it's that information piece that I'm hearing some people are just clamoring for because they just want something, and it seems like the modeling is the way to get at that.
Absolutely. And I think in a formal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service process, like the NEPA process, there is the socioeconomic and environmental impact assessment. I'm not too privy on like how they do that or like what I know that they would be using Tim's new model, but like I said, I do think that the hope is to use it to try to answer some of those questions.
Okay, we're going to take a couple more questions, and then if anybody has additional things to talk to our guest, you can actually just stay over. He'll be here for a few minutes, maybe.
Sure.
Hold on one second.
We saw you a couple months ago at the library.
Yep, I recognize you.
And I asked a question about why they can't bring the otters here more recently. And you said it was about 7, 8 years. Now you're saying 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
I'm depressed.
Yeah, I mean, it's because a lot of it is a lot of it is just, it's a federal, like as it's envisioned and has always been, it's a federal process. And I just don't see U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service making that decision under this administration. So that adds 4 years. And one of the things that has been thrown around is that, the tribe, CT Clusi and the Siletz tribe, they are very interested and involved in this. Is there a way that if they wanted to apply for a permit, could they do it through like a government to government negotiation? That's like not off the table, but as it is now, yeah, it's definitely added some time to the timeline.
I'm going to nerd out about the science again and not so much about the social and economic impacts.
Cool.
I'm curious about that the southern population, and you said that they are experiencing a genetic bottleneck. And so what are sort of like what's the stand-in for that? The poor baby sea otters in the south, because you have a subspecies, so you don't just want to I'm assuming that you can't, or you don't want to just mix in. Can we bring down northern sea otters, mix them in and get some more genetic variation? Or do we need to somehow GMO that stuff? Or what's the solution that California is talking about?
I mean, I think the solution that California is talking about is reintroduction to like bridge the gap. I have not heard anybody from California like fully discuss the idea of bringing a couple of northern sea otters down to share genetics. I mean, I don't know really the science behind that or like whether that would work or what people are thinking, but I've not heard it discussed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, but like I don't think that's a terrible idea.
And then also, if that's southern, that's a danger, what kind of monies can you get from California to help bridge that gap? Or, right, so how can we utilize, or how is that being utilized to, right, to bridge the gap?
So in the main reason that like, because it would just be so much easier probably if we took sea otters from Southeast Alaska. There's a lot of them. Certain people think they're a pest up there, but Fish and Wildlife Service gets money through recovery of a listed species. So with southern sea otters being listed, that is the only way that I've heard from Fish and Wildlife Service that they would be able to actually get money to fund reintroduction. So their listing itself is the means through which there would be federal funding for that reintroduction. So it would probably, from a U.S., I don't want to speak for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but from what I've heard, it would probably be California sea otters who would be brought to Oregon for reintroduction.
Get some from Alaska and California, U.S. Fish and Wildlife gets some from California and like have them meet in the middle. We're like,
Well, meet cute, yeah.
be like a meet.
Yeah, I like it.
I want to say thank you again to everyone who attended our lecture tonight. Thank you to our online listeners, those that are also joining in from the Curry campus. And if you have additional questions for our guest or even our biology professor, Amy Burgess is up here, feel free to come up. We do have additional lectures coming up next month. April 15th, we'll have now Dr. Aaron Coiner be talking a solar physics lecture. And then in May, we have our chemistry lecture that will be discussing the science and art of making beer and wine and whiskey. We have some guests coming over for that. There will not be any alcohol here. I'm sorry. So please stay tuned. And at the end of May 30th, we have our awesome student researchers going to be doing the annual student research symposium. So please kind of show up and show them some love on that. So thank you again.
Average of 6 months.